You people are very lucky that there's a misprint in the posting on the elevator. It makes it look as if I'm going to say something today about the Roby House. And about all I have to say is that I don't fit in it very well. So Grant is going to talk about this as he can, so informatively about so many subjects. We're fortunate that he's available to us in this way, and we're fortunate in an interesting, coincidental way that I wouldn't have expected. He and Gordon Orients taught a course together at the university, and the course links what we know about architecture from what Grant has said before and what he's going to say today with science in a very interesting way. And that's the subject of his talk today. Grant.
Frank Lloyd Wright was, are you hearing me in the back? Is it pretty good? Good. Frank Lloyd Wright in about 1950 was a expert witness at a trial, and he was asked if he was the finest architect in America, and he replied that he was the finest architect in the world. Someone queried him about that later, and he said, "I was under oath." This view that is on your screen is the first building by Wright that I ever saw. It's the Palmer House in Ann Arbor. I had walked out to see it my second year in the architecture program at Michigan. I had heard about it, and I walked out to the edges of Ann Arbor to see it, and I was swept away. I thought it was a beautiful thing. I was taking a course in modern architecture, and we had to do a paper, of course, and we had to clear the paper with the teacher. And I said, I went up to him afterward, and I said that I wanted to do a paper on Wright. And he said, "Why do you want to do that?" And I started to tell him, and he walked out of the room. And I was so mad that I bought a train ticket to Chicago, and I stayed there for a week in a flea-bitten hotel, and went out to Oak Park. I went up to Racine to see Johnson's Wax. I looked at everything I could find, including the Roby House in southern Chicago near the University of Chicago campus. And I came back and did a paper that was good paper. He gave me an A, and we were sort of friends thereafter. I'm going to talk today about Wright's houses, and it will be in sort of two parts. I'll be talking you through the houses rather briefly to give you a sense of what they are and their history, their characteristics and features, and then we'll talk about why people loved them, because they did. The houses have a lot of flaws. Roofs leak, things were over budget, kitchens undersized, no storage space, all kinds of problems. One owner whose roof leaked said, "This is what happens when you leave a work of art out in the rain." But in spite of all that, the owners loved them, and the question is why? And I'm going to try to give you what I believe is a good answer to that. But we start at the beginning. I start my story of Wright in 1902 with the Arthur Hertley House, because it's here, I think, that one of the key features of Wright's designs appears for the first time. You're looking here, obviously, at the street facade, and you see at the middle of the image the sparkling windows on the second floor. Those are the living room. The living room is upstairs. You see the plan here. The stairway is just about at the center of the whole plan. It comes up and ends at that dark mass that is the fireplace. So we come via that circuitous route upstairs to the living space. And you see that the ceiling is pushed up into the volume of the roof. And this is the first time that Wright does this. From here on, if the major space is not immediately under the roof, the house is not by right. You can just about, I can't think of any exception to that. And why? It gives him a chance to play with the space, to do other than just a flat ceiling. And obviously he values this. It's true of his houses, it's true of the Guggenheim, it's true of Johnson's wax. It's a universal feature from here on with Wright. I don't know that anyone else has commented on its ubiquity, but there it is. So 1902, 1904, the Cheney House in Oak Park, both of these quite near Wright's own home. We're looking here at a Marion Mahoney drawing, and this introduces the last key feature of Wright's houses. Where is the front door? You get into this house by going up that path that's at far right of the image, and you go back toward the garden, and about 2/3 of the way back you turn left and enter the house from the side into that space. And here you see the plan. The fireplace, again, the dark mass at the middle. Forward of it is that elongated space with all the lines in it. That's the living, dining, and music room, and it opens via those French doors to the terrace that's down at the bottom of the image. The owner now is taking very poor care of the house. It's not in good shape. This is a view of it with the entry, the walkway at just left of center toward the bottom off the sidewalk. The image is a house not in good condition, and he's a slob. This is the interior, and it's a mess, and I'm sorry about that. But we enter here, and the fireplace is off to our right, just out of the camera, actually, with a low ceiling, and forward of it, you see that the ceiling rises, as we saw it at the Hertley house, just the previous example. The ceiling rises up into the volume of the roof. This is a small house, but Wright by this time was by no means a modest practitioner. He was able to secure very large and very wealthy commissions, and this is one of them, the Avery Coonley House of 1906, the plan. You can see that it's strewn all over the place. It's a very complex and elaborate plan. The living space is the large volume down toward the bottom, just left of center. And again, it's upstairs. You go up the stairway that you can see just upper left of that large area, and you find yourself in, again, the elevated living space, which again is elevated to get it under the roof so that he can play with it spatially, as you see here. The ceiling rises almost dome-like up into the volume of the roof. This gives him a structural problem, and here we touch on the first quasi-scientific aspect of things. A ceiling like this will tend to collapse, as does a dome, unless it's restrained from doing so. It must somehow be locked in place. In the Cheney house and the Hertley house, he had that chimney mast to anchor the roof. Here, he doesn't. And again, no one has commented on this. I pointed it out in an elaborate footnote. I think that horizontal line, you see there's a hallway going off just right of center, off down the way, and across it is a horizontal line that everyone, I think, has dismissed as just trim. I think it's part of a tension ring that holds the dome-like ceiling in place. It locks the horizontals and the diagonals, and it stabilizes the thing. Wright could be very clever in structure, and I think this is one example of it. The Frederick Roby House, this is a famous one. It's not entirely my favorite. I like the Coonley better for its wandering fluidity. This is a more rigid composition, but it's a famous one. 1909. If you imagine yourself standing there where the figure is on the sidewalk and looking back up to the house, you realize that those brick terraces block completely the glass. You cannot see, you can't intrude on the privacy of the house from the sidewalk. This is very clever and carefully done, and that it's not coincidence is shown by the bedroom up above in which the same condition obtains. This is 1909. I thought it might be interesting for you to see this in context, a piece of the time. Yes, you see, this is 2 years later than the Roby House. This is 1911.
Where is the house?
The house is in Chicago, near the University of Chicago campus, immediately adjacent to the University of Chicago campus. It's been used by the university from time to time. So, the Roby House, 1909. People sometimes ask, was Wright really a genius, or was it just a kind of a PR? He was a genius, no question. I'm including one non-residential building, the Oak Park Unity Temple. I'm going to have to turn this off for just a moment. Unity Temple I include because of its relationship to the Richards Library, or Richards Laboratories at University of Pennsylvania by Lou Kahn that Henry Matthews talked to you about. You see here at the left the high church proper volume with those square piers at the corners, and to the right is the social hall. The space between them is again a circuitous entrance. I should have pointed out in the case of the Roby House, again you don't see the front door. You must wander around in back, you can see on the model, you must wander around in back to an entry that is all but hidden. And that is true of the Unity Temple as well. The entry is up in that middle space between the social hall and the church proper. I'm sorry, I'm going backwards. There you go. Here you can see those corner towers with the four great supporting columns inside them. The corner towers are stair and air circulation ducts, and the space. Quite a remarkable and beautiful space. The site was near the Oak Park trolley tracks and was noisy, and Wright has used poured-in-place concrete here, a very strange usage for a church, but he brings it off, and the concrete serves as a sound barrier. The windows are high, so the concrete extends upward to block the sound. The light comes from them and from the roof. Those square panels that you see at the top of the image are skylights, every one of them. Well, 1909, Wright goes off to Europe with Mrs. Cheney. A scandal. He stays for a year in Fiesole above Florence, where he sees completed the Wasmuth portfolio of drawings of his projects to that date, a major production that's being done in Berlin. A magnificent portfolio of work. It's drawings by Marion Mahoney primarily. We've seen her drawing of the Coonley living room and the Cheney exterior. Wonderful portfolio, finished and seen through production. And they return to Scandal and to a retreat. Wright builds for them a house up in central Wisconsin near Spring Green and gives it the name of a Welsh poet, Taliesin. This you see here in aerial view. It is, again, a house in which the entry is not evident. You don't know how to get in. How do you get in? Well, you tuck yourself under those roofs about at the center of the thing and wander around for a while and find yourself at the door. This is the site of the great tragedy of 1914, in which the cook murdered Mrs. Cheney and her 2 children and burned the house. Wright happened to be in Chicago at the time. He was not here, and he came back to disaster and desperation. He was shaken by the event, obviously, deeply. I think Mama Borthwick, Mrs. Cheney, was probably the one real love of his life, and it was a tragedy that struck very deeply. But he rebuilt Taliesin and fussed around with it really for the rest of his life. If you can find the entry and get into it, you find yourself here in the grand living space, again tucked right under the roof with the ceiling rising into the volume. The fireplace is just off camera to the right and is accompanied by that built-in seat that I call a kind of half inglenook. This is the grand space, the cozy fire with its built-in seat, and opposite it, views out to the Wisconsin countryside that he loved. He writes about this building in his autobiography, about its design and construction, and he writes beautifully about it. He talks about the roofs whose slopes echoed the slopes of the roofs of the hills round about, the plaster whose color was the sand of the riverbank, because that is where it came from. He talks about the icicles hanging from the roof in winter, a house of the north. A beautiful essay about a beautiful building. But the scandal and his subsequent return to this distant, remote house leads to a loss of local clientele. But he has 2 great opportunities. He is hired to do the Imperial Hotel in Japan, and he spends a great deal of time in Japan, falls in love with it, and does at the same time some houses in California. Hollyhock House in L.A. He said no house should be on a hill, but here is Hollyhock House on a hill. Consistency is the crutch of small minds. He did a series of concrete block houses. He called them textile block. He intended to make a concrete block a beautiful thing, and I think he did. This is La Miniatura, textile block, punctuated by openings above the range of French doors that you see leading out to that little terrace. There are 3 buildings that I've never seen and wish I had. One is the pyramids. I've never seen them, and I've never seen the Alhambra, and I wish I had. The third is this. It's a beautiful thing, and I've never been able to get into it. It's always been very private, but I think a lovely house. Again, we come in by the fire with the high ceiling under the roof and the French doors leading out to that rather lovely ravine with its water. The Ennis house, which is as big as La Miniatura, is small, another of the concrete block California series. Then, of course, the Depression, which adds to Wright's problems of money. He always seemed to have those. His motto was, "I buy the luxuries and let the necessities take care of themselves," which is not policy for financial stability. But he addresses himself in the Depression to making houses that are affordable, that can be useful in a hard time, difficult time. He writes his autobiography, incorporates himself, and begins a school to raise a little bit of money. He manages to make his apprentices pay him to work for him, which is rather a nice way to function. This is one of the series of intended low-cost houses of the 1930s that he began. He called them Usonians. We don't know why. If you work out the syllables, you can make United States of America out of it, but I'm not sure. He never explained the term, but he called them that. And this is the Hanna House, the Paul Hanna House in Palo Alto, that is one of the early examples. This is not a small economical house at all. It's a large, rather elaborate one, designed on a hexagonal module of all things. It's of interest to me because the fireplace, again, is at center, as we've seen it in the other buildings. But in this case, he folds the space back around the fireplace so that one gets these trails that disappear around a bend in the space. Here you see the fire at right and the space leading onward around the bend, and then of course the French doors leading out to a beautiful garden. The ceiling again following the volume of the roof. The typical Usonian was intended to be much smaller. This is the Getch-Winkler house, East Lansing, from the late 1930s. I think 1939 is the date of this one. You remember the horizontals of the Roby house? Here they are. And one that is available to the public, so I'm going to show you a little bit more of that. The Pope Leahy house near D.C. of 1937. Horizontal roofs, flat roofs, fascinating plan that combines order and complexity. It's worked on a rectangular grid, as you see. You enter at what is the top of this image and come down toward the fire, which is that shaded square just left of center. The dining room, the dining space is shown with the dining table. You see it drawn there. And the bedroom wing leading off to the right. You come into the, you notice that there are a lot of corners, which you'd think is not a particularly economical way to build. A simple rectangle is more economical. But this yields varieties of outlook, doesn't it? You see in different directions from many spaces. And it yields a complexity of interest, I think, in the spaces that it yields. Here we've come into the living space. We're looking at the fireplace. And to the right is the dining space under a lower ceiling, a little more intimate kind of volume. And the entry is the bright doors in the distance and the steps that lead down to yield a higher ceiling, a higher volume. And here, the rather library refuge-like end of the space, relieved, I think, beautifully by that vertical band of windows off to the left. Handsome little intimate edge to the living space. 1936, Edgar Kaufman asks Wright to do a house for him. He owns a plot of land in southwestern Pennsylvania that includes a river with waterfalls. And And he wants Wright to build a house on that site. He has a favorite spot on the site, a rock on which he meditates and looks at the water, and he thinks that Wright can build something that will respect that and provide a house itself for that meditating purpose. He talks to Wright and goes back home, and a week goes by and no response. A month goes by and nothing. Finally, on a Wednesday, he calls Wright and says that he's coming up on Saturday and he'd like to see what Wright has done. Wright does nothing on the Wednesday of the phone call. He does nothing on the Thursday and nothing on Friday. Saturday morning, he gets up and by lunchtime has his scheme for Kaufman. I doubt very much that he did this drawing in 4 hours, but he must have produced a sketch, something rather like it, and a set of, at least a draft of floor plans, because clearly he has designed the scheme in that time, and the rest of it is design development. I gave a large print of this to the Monday market, and I think someone bought it rather soon. It's sizable. It's a gorgeous drawing, isn't it a beautiful thing? And one imagines that Kaufman was struck by it. I can't imagine otherwise. And so falling water happens. It's built down over the spot that Kaufman used for his meditations. Again, the entry, where is it? Where's the door? It's around back to the right. We're standing on the bridge that comes over the water. Around and back, you come around and find yourself at the fire, the usual thing you greet on entry in Wright's designs, and forward of it, these trays that look out over the water. This was a spot that Kaufman used to use to sit and observe the water, and Wright has built over it. And this was a surprise to Kaufman, but do you see what it does? If you think of the house being back up on the hill, where it would leave that meditation spot free still, it would be a spectator. And in bringing it down to where it is, it becomes a participant, doesn't it? It becomes a part of this thing that is the composite of the water and the house and the ravine and the woods. It's a participant, and I think that is a part of its magic, that it is an element of the composition and not an onlooker. Wright, by this time, has built a secondary home in Arizona that he called Taliesin West. I'm not going to dwell on it. I should tell you that this talk is, to some extent, a synopsis of a book that I did on Wright's houses that's in our library called The Wright Space. It has been a successful book. It's had very fine reviews, and you can turn to it if you like to develop more detail in what I'm telling you. I'm dealing with only a part of it. I talk about Taliesin West there at some extent. It gets a chapter to itself. I'm not going to dwell on it here. It was built when Scottsdale was a crossroads. It is not a crossroads anymore, as you know. And finally, to bring us from the beginning of Wright's work that is of importance with the Hertley House, I'm going to take you to this house, the one I saw in Ann Arbor, that is perhaps the last of Wright's houses that he did himself. He was busy with the Guggenheim at this time, and he was giving most of his houses to the apprentices to do, and they show it. Many of them are not strong designs. This he did himself. Mary and Billy Palmer are the owners. Mary was a charmer. I knew her well. She charmed Wright into doing it himself, and the drawings are entirely by him. I've seen them all. They are by his hand, and I've had an endorsement of that from the Taliesin archives themselves. He did it, and he did it well. If he had leaking roofs and sagging overhangs, not here. Here the shingle roof is underlaid by a metal roof. The cantilevered roofs are structured in steel. This is a house that he built to be a beautiful thing, and he built it to last. This is a unique, all but unique, example in Wright's work of a house in which the entry is evident and strongly modeled. But this isn't the way Wright intended the thing to be oriented. Mary Palmer was a strong-minded person in her own right, and she turned the house almost 180 degrees on the site from what Wright had designed. Had it been built the way he oriented it in the first place, the entry would again be coy. Here it's declared quite strongly and quite beautifully, I think. The house is designed on a triangular module, which one would think would be almost impossible, but it works quite beautifully. The living room is the space at the top. It becomes almost a hexagon, doesn't it? And the little pointy thing down at the bottom is Billy Palmer's study. The bedroom's lying between the study and the living room. The entry is right at center of the image, coming off the driveway and the carport. This is a house I got to know very well through its owners. I knew them well, and I spent a good bit of time here. Photo by Baltasar Korab of the interior. We're looking from the fire here over toward the dining and the kitchen, but the reproduction has come off rather weakly. I'm sorry about that. You can find in the book, in the library that I did on this house, you can find this picture much more clearly shown. I'm quite proud of this book. It was great fun to do. I knew the clients in the house so well, and I had a lovely time doing the book. It was a great joy. So that brings us now to the end of Wright's residential career. We've gone through it rather quickly. I'm going to do a sidebar now, and I'll leave this image on the screen for you. It's a nice picture. You can look at that while we digress. 1978, J. Appleton, the English geographer, gave a talk at the university that changed my life. He had written a book called The Experience of Landscape, in which he argued that landscapes that we especially like and landscape paintings that we find appealing possess certain repetitive characteristics that he associated with survival advantage. He called these, and this is a very brief and inadequate, superficial account of Jay's work, but I'll try to give it some justice. He argued that these landscapes show an area, a grove, even a cave occasionally, a place of containment, a haven, in which one would be secure against predators, and this would be contiguous with an open space, a meadow, an expanse, often with water, usually with water, that would provide a place of hunting and foraging, so a food supply. He called the space of containment, the haven, a refuge, and the open meadow, the more open space, a prospect. And he argued that, as with many of our choices, this would have been based on an appeal that these spaces would have held for our ancient ancestors, or some of them. Those who chose other spaces would have a less advantageous position in their dealings with the world and their lives. People who chose these conditions would be selected for, he would argue. They would have a better shot at getting the next generation in place, and so on. And he argued that we, as their late progeny over many, many infinite generations, would possess the same appeal for these spaces, although their survival advantage would no longer be important to us. He argued this, I thought, quite effectively. I was struck by the talk. I thought it cut the boundary between science and art in a way, that it argued an aesthetic that we could give a solid foundation to, that we could say that this aesthetic was believable, that we had a foundation for the position. I talked with Gordon Orions quite a lot about my understanding of evolution, and he helped me a great deal, and I'd invented a course to teach this, and he, I must say, co-taught that with me and was a great help in doing so. Gordon, I'm not sure I've done justice to Jay's argument. I hope I've done a reasonable job of it. We'll hope. Is there something you'd like to add to my... we don't have a lot of time, but if you can, yes. Can you? Please do.
Jay Appleton at Hull University got interested in landscape, but he didn't quite know what to do with it. What do you study? What are the theories? How do you get on with it? And he was baffled and didn't know what to do. And one day he was vacationing in a friend's house in the Lake District, and on a little table next to the bed was a book by Konrad Lorenz, King Solomon's Ring. And Konrad Lorenz ended up sharing the Nobel Prize with Nico Tinbergen in medicine. And the idea of, he was reading this book, King Solomon's Ring, which was, King Solomon was able to talk to the animals, and Konrad Lorenz was talking to the animals. But he recalls he's walking through the woods in the spring one day and comes to a little glade. And he stops and looks out at the opening and says, "How wonderful it is to see without being seen."
There you go.
And
yes.
Jay Appleton
Yes.
said, "That's it.
Yes.
That's the idea I needed."
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
then guided what he did in developing the prospect refuge
Yeah.
theory,
Yeah.
and which Grant used in the study of architecture,
Yeah.
and which I used then in the study of landscapes.
My learning from Jay, however, was, as Gordon has pointed out, entirely to do with landscapes. And I thought that if we are to make real use of these understandings, we need to apply them to buildings, because that's where we spend most of our lives. We don't live in the wild. We're in a building now. We are born in one, and we live in one, and we study in one, and so forth. I thought it needed to be applied to architecture if it was going to be of real use. And I have tried to do that with, I think, some success. I've done 2 books on that subject. One is The Right Space, which was trying this idea out on Wright's houses, and the other is Origins of Architectural Pleasure, which extends it to a more general theoretical position. It seemed to me then that it needed to be applied to buildings, and Wright's houses just felt right. They felt as though that was going to be a useful study. And I began, as we began today, with the Hertley House. And you will remember that we follow a circuitous path to a fire, and forward of it a larger volume that looks out to the exterior. And we saw in the Cheney house, the house itself is a refuge. The entry can't be seen. It's a secret place. And it is backed by a dense wood in this drawing and a more spare landscape in front of it. And Wright meant this to be the way that these were to be surrounded by plantings. We go in, and in spite of the scruffy mess, we find ourselves in a low ceilinged space with a fire just out of camera to the right that I've called the interior refuge. And forward of it, the brighter, more high ceilinged space that I would like to call the interior prospect. And they lead out then at extreme left to the terrace, the exterior prospect that is provided. Here the fire on the left and the terrace on the right, and the high ceiling of the interior prospect space. And so, to jump rather quickly, we find ourselves again at Falling Water. No entry apparent. How do we get in? We must find the secret entry to the refuge that is the house itself. And we enter by this tiny, tucked away little doorway that is actually a little below the actual floor level, and we climb into this secret place and find ourselves, as we always do with Wright, at the fire. The refuge, interior refuge, the place of haven, of warmth and enclosure, the secure retreat. And forward of it, the prospect. This is an example of a raised ceiling that can't go very far. Wright built this with these concrete slabs and was very limited in the degree to which he could model the space. That aside, of course, it's a remarkable example. We are here in the refuge with the fire, and forward of us, the interior prospect that leads us out, of course, to this exterior prospect and the house. And here, this is perhaps the most dramatic, radical, modern house that one can imagine, and yet its experience is lodged in the depths of time. Why should I be concerned with these intuitive reactions and with describing them in a conscious way? Wright never wrote about this. He never talks about the tucked away entry or the interior refuge, the prospect that is garnered by the higher ceiling, brighter space. He never talks about it. He writes a lot, but he doesn't write about that, because to him, I think it's entirely intuitive. There was something in his gut that told him that this was the way to model the space. And in this sense, you realize that the houses, although completely different, are all alike. They're all alike in that sequence. Falling Water is just like the Cheney house in the experience that I've described. It was intuitive with him. It was a constant. And it's intuitive with us. The people who love these houses don't analyze them as I have today. By no means. They love them so much that there's one instance of a couple who got divorced but both stayed in the same house because they couldn't bear to leave it. That's love for you of a certain sort. And why then should I be concerned with bringing these things to a conscious level? I'm concerned because I think it gives the architect some powerful tools. It gives us a teaching opportunity, a set of conditions that can be understood and utilized to design, though I say it, to design beauty. And that seems to me to be worthwhile. I've left a little time for questions. I'd be glad to try to deal with them or discuss any aspect of this that you'd like. I hope I've been successful in showing you something of why we love these houses. There are no questions. I've covered the ground specifically. Over there somewhere. Where are we? Hi, George.
Grant, did Wright ever show any sensitivity to the need for handicap accessibilities in his designs?
I can't think of a single case. No, that was not his concern at all. And, you know, it wasn't really until embarrassingly recent times. You look at the Supreme Court building, any of that, no, we don't. That's a recent issue. I can't think of an instance where that was an issue with him, no. No.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm curious. One thing I learned, a student of Frank Lloyd Wright designed a house saying it's something Frank Lloyd Wright had taught him. This is in San Francisco Bay Area, Walnut Creek. The roof is flat.
Yeah.
It extends out.
Yeah.
However, it's at the angle to allow the winter sun to shine in on the floor, warm the house, and yet the roof is designed also come late spring, summertime, then the living room in the living space is in shadow. And you can do that a lot in many parts of North America. And the students said, oh yes, Frank Lloyd Wright considered landscape, and an element or elements of landscape are to provide the warmth of the sun when you need it, like late fall, winter, and spring, but shade in the summer. I don't know. This house, I believe, was designed 1950, and the construction occurred from 50 to 60. And the papers are at UC Berkeley. But curious, what is your awareness of when Frank Lloyd Wright included in landscape factors of warming the floor and cooling the house in the summer? Warming in the winter, cooling in the summer.
The Roby house is one good example of exactly that. The overhangs are such as to provide the condition you described. They provide shade in, and they are exactly tailored to the angles of the sun in Chicago. It isn't happenstance. It's very carefully modeled to provide shade and sun in the way you've described. And what's more, the terraces with their plantings, I think, were thought through to provide a conditioning. They're not exactly landscape, but one could call them that, to provide a conditioning of the spaces. Because if you see, let me try to bring up for you. I'm not sure I can do it readily. The The house is designed with a fan in the roof space that exits air out through the chimney, through the through vents that are evident in the chimney. Maybe I can find it. Yes, do you see here the chimney is L-shaped, and there is a grill in the L. Can you see that? I hope so. Yes. Yeah, that is an exit for the air that is drawn across the plantings of the terraces into the spaces and then up through the roof and out. So yes, Wright gave a great deal of very close attention to that kind of thing you described, and thank you for bringing it up. I wouldn't be surprised at all to think that Wright had taught that to his students. That it's a very nice point. Thank you.
I lived for 50 years in a house which was built by one of Wright's students.
Did you?
And we bought it from him in the early 70s, 72, and lived there for 50 years.
Did you?
And it had all the elements that you've talked about, although it was for the common man. But it had the horrible leaky flat roof and all that went with it.
Yeah.
But it had all the other beautiful things.
Yeah.
It sat beautifully on the lot.
Yeah.
And it had all the heating advantages
Yeah.
that my colleague down here.
Well, you lived there.
Mercer Island. It was on Mercer Island.
You lived there for quite some time. I
Yes.
gather you liked it.
We didn't want to leave.
Yes.
No.
Good for you.
So
Yeah.
it came through with all the promises
Yeah.
that all of his expensive places did.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that account. Yeah.
Take it down to Henry.
When one of these pieces of art are sold to the public, or does that happen, or are they retained are most of them retained as belonging to the public? Are they foundations?
It varies. The Roby House has had various owners, and Andy, you said it's privately owned now. It was owned for a while by the Adlai Stevenson Institute that used it as their headquarters. It was owned for some time by the University of Chicago that used it as a dormitory for a while, much to its damage. The Palmer House that I've described for you in Ann Arbor is now a B&B, breakfast and bed and breakfast, and you can stay there if you like. It's an interesting place. It has an elaborate garden with a tea house that was done by one of Wright's apprentices, John Howe. The others, most of them are retained in private hands. I wish I could get into La Miniatura, as I've told you, but it's been privately owned, and they really don't want people coming by. Most of them are in private hands. The Pope Lay house that I showed you, the one with the modular, the grid and that Usonian, that is open to the public. I'm not sure of the hours, but that is publicly owned by the National Trust. And I can't think of other examples. Hollyhock House is open in L.A. You can visit that. The Friedman House, which is another of the textile blocks in L.A., is owned by Southern Cal University. And the Hanna House, I think, is owned by Stanford now. I can't think of other examples.
Down to Henry.
Yes, yeah, good point, Gordon, of course. Yeah, Falling Water is open to tours. I think Taliesin as well, but I'm not sure. Taliesin West, of course, is a thriving business. Thriving, yeah.
Thank you, Grant, for giving us such pleasure. I taught the history of architecture for many years, and of course I talked about Wright, and I was lucky that there were so many good books about Wright. But I have to say that the Wright space was just a joy to read and to get ideas from. And once I had that, I often talked about refuge and prospect. But I urge all of you to look at that book in the library. It's really analyzes Wright's intentions so well and explains things beautifully.
Thank you, Henry. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question. When I look at all your beautiful pictures of Wright's houses, Wright remains in control. Any house I've lived in has been transformed by books and pictures and things like that, and furniture. But if you live in a Wright house, you have to throw away most of your art and your books so that his beautiful materials will dominate. Do you think this is a fair statement?
Yes, I think it is. And it depends on one's viewpoint about things. I agree with you. It's hard to imagine just putting up a bunch of pictures in the in falling water, for example. It doesn't work. On the other hand, the owner of the Palmer House, Mary Palmer, her last words to me were, "Is it wrong to love a house so much?" She found it was its own artwork, and she valued it in that way. But yes, it does require a certain adjustment of attitude in exactly the way you're describing, and some people find that not acceptable. I understand the
Well,
point.
I would say that the same thing can be found in Green and Green's
Yes.
beautiful
Yeah.
craftsman houses.
Yeah.
Like, what's the famous one?
The
in-
Gamble House.
The Gamble House
Which
in
is-
Pasadena.
Which is practically in La Miniatura's backyard. I wanted to say too, though I do say it, that the Wright space has been called the one book on Wright that you must read if you have only one. It's the book to
I'd agree.
to read. Yeah, I'm very proud of that.
Are there any contemporary architects that you would consider to be close to Wright's abilities?
Oh, well. I began this with that joke about the finest architect in the world and Wright being under oath. And it's kind of a joke, but in his own lifetime at least, it kind of comes to that. Who else do you put in the spot? I don't know. I like Tom Kundig and his work very much indeed. And there are others. You know that I care for Gordon Walker's work very much and have done a book about him. George Suyama. We have some of the best architects in the world right here in the Pacific Northwest. I don't know who I'd cite by name other than that for the moment. There are many. I wrote a book on Paul Kirk, whose work I think was remarkable, and there was a whole school around him that I've called the Puget Sound School that did beautiful work in wood at small scale, unsurpassed, I think, in its quality in the nation in its time. I'm wondering. I hope I've done a fair job of describing this material. I've tried to. It's been a project of condensation.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's wonderful.